Hello and welcome to the Klassiki podcast. I'm your host, Sam Goff. Klassiki is your window into the world of Eastern European film. Subscribers gain access to our library of classic and contemporary titles, as well as filmmaker interviews, video introductions, program notes, and much more. You can sign up for a free trial today at klassiki.online. If you enjoy the show, don't forget to subscribe in your podcast app of choice, and remember you can always get in touch with us at podcast@klassiki.online. This Friday, the 6th of March, is the 100th birthday of Andrzej Wajda, the grand old man of Polish cinema. The Kinoteka Polish Film Festival has been running a wonderful retrospective here in London that's still ongoing, and on Klassiki we are screening a two-part tribute to Wajda. Until the 26th of March, subscribers can watch his epochal doubleheader Man of Marble and Man of Iron, two films about the history of worker resistance in communist Poland. And we're also running two of Wajda's great literary adaptations, Siberian Lady Macbeth and The Promised Land. With a career running from the 1950s all the way up to the 2010s, it can be hard to know where to start with Wajda. One thread that runs throughout his incredibly varied filmography is his dogged exploration of Poland's troubled modern history, from the 19th century through the trauma of the war and the communist era that followed. It's one reason why he's so revered in his homeland to this day. So, in order to dig a little deeper into Andrzej Wajda's history lessons, I invited Owen Hatherley to join me once again on the pod. Listeners may remember Owen from our episode on tower block cinema, but he's not only an architecture expert, he's also a Polish film and history aficionado. We discussed some of Wajda's recurring themes and concerns and the highs and lows of his national history on film. Check out the show description to watch both strands of our own Wajda tribute and for links to some of the writing on his work that we've published over on the Klassiki Journal. Owen, welcome back to the show. It's been a while.
It's a pleasure as always.
So, Wajda. It's a little difficult to know exactly where to start because this is a man who started in the 50s and then made films very regularly until the 2010s. So there's no way we're going to get through everything or kind of cover every facet of how he went about his business. But this idea that I thought we might try and explore a bit is this idea of Wajda, the historian. Because I think there is this idea with Wajda that he's something of a history teacher for Poland, and like a lot of his canonical status comes from his having made so many films about Polish history and kind of the soul searching involved in the kind of Polish national character and everything that's befallen Poland in the last 2 centuries and so on. So I thought maybe that was a way in that would allow us to skip through most of his career, cover enough interesting bases, and maybe get at why he's so revered, like why he's become such an establishment figure.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, he is, and I think was very consciously like a national filmmaker in the way that, like, you know, someone like Goethe or Shakespeare or Pushkin or Mickiewicz or whatever is like a national poet. Like, you know, very, very kind of like, I think from fairly early on took that on as a sort of mantle. But if it was just that, I think he would be quite boring because, you know, if you're not Polish and frequently if you are Polish, that sort of that Polish national narrative can be very limiting and self-important. And one of the things I like about him is how much he actually tires of it quite a lot, and he's kind of torn a lot of the time between his sort of patriotism and his intelligence. And the best films are those in which he manages to combine them, but that's not always the case.
I'm glad that you led with that line, and so I didn't have to. Yeah, it's true, and he's also kind of, particularly once he really gets going into the 60s and 70s, he's often jumping kind of from one film to the next from these deep historical dives, period pieces, or whatever you want to call them, with these portraits of kind of contemporary Polish life. Like he made a lot of films about his social cultural milieu, and maybe we can talk about some of those as well, because I think
Yeah,
the two currents of kind of contemporary experience and history converge in the films Man of Marble and Man of Iron, which I think is
yeah.
eventually where this conversation might get to.
He's someone who I think, lots of the crux of him for me is this kind of, he has a very interesting middle age. He kind of,
Right.
from about Everything for Sale in 1969 until Man of Iron in 81, there's this sort of sequence of very kind of raw, kind of fast, sometimes rather garish films, often with things like Eurodisco soundtracks and things that,
Mm.
you really wouldn't expect from a lot of his reputation, that really kind of like throw a lot of ideas in the air about the nation and politics and economics in a way that's very kind of subtle and dialectical, and they're not hectoring films at all. And at the same time he's doing this, he has this sort of unit X in the Polish film industry where he kind of nurtures the careers of a lot of people like Andrzej Wajda, Agnieszka Holland. I think, Polish cinema has a great 50s and a great 70s and a quite dull 60s and I think kind of interesting but questionable 80s. And a lot
Well,
of
they
that
were
kind of,
under martial law for
yeah,
some of that.
exactly. But that kind of wave of Polish cinema where it really revives in a big way in the 70s is driven by Wajda not just as a director but also as a producer. So he has a really kind of positive effect of kind of, there's so many people that he's kind of connected to. He's not sort of a lone auteur. People like kind of Skolimowski and Holland and Szewowski really kind of come up in his slipstream and are people that he kind of, discovers as a stretch, but people that he spots and helps along the way.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we might as well start at least briefly with the Vida films that most people are most aware of, which is the War trilogy, where he's
Yeah,
kind of his breakthrough, and this is Canal, A Generation, and Ashes and Diamonds.
yeah,
These are these epochal films of what's called the Polish Film School, this
yep,
post-war kind of 50s loose grouping, largely made up of people who'd been to Łódź Film School, of which Wajda was a kind of figurehead, and
mm-hmm.
they were revivifying Polish film by basically going back to the Second World War and doing it properly, as like doing it in a
Yeah, yeah,
non-heroic, non-communistic, propagandistic, Stalinistic way. So,
yeah.
and
Although
the
there was
war is
something, yeah.
really the war and the kind of question of like the socialism that emerged out of it. That's really like
Mm.
the foundation stone for Wajda.
Yeah,
Something he comes back to a lot.
absolutely. And I mean, the thing with that trilogy is each one is sort of more explicit in, sort of each one sort of takes on sort of more taboos as they go along. But in a way that's again sort of more subtle and I think lots of people will give credit for. So I think we should probably sort of sketch out the context a little for people that don't know, insofar as so Poland obviously has a very traumatic war. It gets invaded by both the USSR and Nazi Germany. After the war, it's sort of, I suppose, a phrase someone once used as sort of rescued but not liberated by the Soviets, and sort
Hmm.
of rebuilt as, particularly from 1948 until 55, 56, as a sort of as a Stalinist dictatorship, which has very, very little popular support, which I think contrasts it to some of the other countries in the region, Czechoslovakia, most obviously, Yugoslavia, even more so, where there was a degree of actual mass support for the Communist Party. And that was, in Poland, the Communist Party had been wiped out, not by the Germans, but been wiped out by the Soviets in the late 1930s, who killed almost the entire leadership of the party. So, it had a much more sort of colonial relationship with the USSR than a lot of other places. And the film industry, is set up initially very much as a sort of modeled on, the sort of high Stalinist cinema. But as we know now, now we can kind of talk about these things honestly, a lot of Stalinist cinema is pretty good. And in the Polish case, the kind of great filmmaker who kind of, I think to a degree, sort of mentors Wajda early on is Alexander Ford. And A Generation, the first of that trilogy, is not a million miles away from a Ford film. For one thing, it's about the Polish resistance, but it's about the communist minority within that resistance. So by the second film, you kind of it kind of narrows in just a small group of people surviving at the end of the Warsaw Rising in the sewers when, those that survived the rising, that's generally how they did it. It's by literally, kind of escaping from the city, through the drains. And then Ashes and Diamonds is kind of interesting because it tackles the part of the Home Army, which the kind of non-communist resistance that was most taboo and most kind of criticized, which was the part of it that continued the war against the Soviets after 1945.
Right.
Most of the leadership of the Home Army very reluctantly kind of, put down their weapons after 1945, but a contingent of sort of impossibilists kind of went into the forest and fought the Soviets for a few years. And the main character in that film, played by Zbigniew Cybulski, the kind of so-called British James Dean, is one of these irreconcilables. And the film actually doesn't, he's a kind of hero of a sort. But ultimately, I've always taken the film as being like, this is completely fucking futile. And, that this is a kind of, that Polish history sort of recurs and kind of pejoratively recurs with like doomed uprisings. And there's this whole sort of history of, doomed uprisings against the Russians, doomed uprisings against the Nazis, frequently kind of made in the knowledge that you're always going to lose anyway, as a sort of symbolic stand. And, this sort of stuff which gets sort of very tied up with Poland's particular version of Catholicism. There's a phrase which people sometimes say of straight face about Poland being the Christ of nations. And, that all that sort of stuff is swimming around in the 50s. And Ashes and Diamonds, I think, is a film that kind of looks at that and finds it wanting approach to the subject. And it kind of it gives it a certain credit. And Cybulski is not treated as a cartoon. He's not some sort of, foaming at the mouth, sort of anti-Semitic kind of,
I mean, he's cool.
He's cool and he's hip, but he's also ultimately in a doomed cause, which,
right, yeah,
is sort of presented as necessarily doomed.
And it's, I guess it's up to the viewer how romantically they take that kind of sunglasses wearing portrait of doomedness. And I guess that's also, it's kind of important, that film in particular, because one thing about Wajda is his attitude towards, I'm going to use the word socialism here, or the socialism that they had in Poland.
Yeah, but it's state socialism.
The state socialism that they had in Poland is nuanced, and it's complicated, and I think it changes over time. Obviously, I mean, this is a guy who, from his family background, you might think was predisposed to.
I think was very much
conservative or nationalist.
I mean, he's from a sort of small town military background in eastern Poland, and on top of that, his father is killed in the Kasin Forest massacre when the Soviets just massacre thousands of members of the Polish kind of military caste. And he later makes a film which I've not seen about this, which I don't hear great things about. It is 2007. But a huge amount. One of the kind of things about this era is that the people at the top are frequently people that have kind of gone through this experience in one way or another. I mean, one example of this is Władysław Gomułka, who comes to power in 1956. He was one of the communist leaders that did not spend the war in Moscow, but instead was very much sort of on the ground. And an even more obvious example is General Wojciech Jaruzelski, who launches martial law against Solidarity in 1981, and was famous for his sunglasses, which he wore because he was partially sighted because he'd been blinded while in a Siberian camp, while imprisoned by the Russians. So there is this thing where even the people who were leading the system were victims of it a lot of the time, which makes it highly unusual as I think repressive systems go. And Wajda is very much a sort of species of that. He's someone who did enormously well out of the system. He made a lot of films where he could tackle things that were very, very taboo, no questions asked. He did that with the knowledge that, these were the people that killed his dad. So, there is a sense that he's someone that I think understood the nuance of that system because of the fact that his life was defined by it, and after it ends, I think it's fair to say creatively he never really recovers.
I think a lot of people would agree with that. So you mentioned Unit X, the slightly ominous
Mm.
sounding production unit that Vida set up in the 60s, in which he then kind of ran through into the 80s, and like you say, he used it to help launch a lot of important careers in Polish cinema, and he used it to get a lot of his own films made, particularly in the 1970s.
Mm.
And these are the films I think that really make his name as a quote unquote historical filmmaker or period
Mm.
filmmaker. He makes a run of films here, a lot of which are adapted from classic Polish literature, which is another Wajda staple. He loved Polish literature and the kind of Polish artistic tradition, having been trained as a painter. And he'd drawn it a lot, particularly in the 60s and 70s. So from The Ashes in 1965, which is from a novel by Stefan Żeromski, which is a kind of Napoleonic epic. And then, you know, he adapts a number of different 19th and 20th century writers. There's The Wedding from Stanisław Wyspiański, The Birchwood from Jarosław Iwaszkiewicz. Anyway, just listing films isn't super interesting,
Mm.
but just there is this, he does kind of get into a groove, if you like, of these kind of classic Polish texts and artistic sources, and he does kind of get into this period piece groove, which I think is
Yeah, and
also
I
important to
think,
his reputation.
and you know, like and I suppose that to me is often the kind of less interesting side of him. I mean, you know, like the Wodna has a scene in which, you know, Polish cavalry charge German tanks. You know, a thing which never happened that loads of people now believe happened because it happens in that film. And that kind of stuff for the heads, I think. But the film that I really liked from that period, the kind of one between the trilogy and him kind of reviving, I think, around Time Everything for Sale, is Innocent Sorcerers, which comes out in 1960, which I really, really love. Um, I mean, it's very much a sort of Warsaw hipster classic. Like there's literally like an Innocent Sorcerers festival, which I don't know if it's still happening, but it's definitely happening for a while, in which people kind of like turn up and listen to 1950s Polish jazz and, you know, wear those clothes and hang out pretending to be those characters. But I love it partly because it's a really enjoyable film. It's, you know, a sort of great example of the hangout movie, a thing that Vida is not often credited with being a great hangout movie director.
No.
But also the fact that you know, there's this particular idea of how Eastern European society was in this era and how Eastern European film was, which, you know, it's sort of people struggling against a giant Kafkaesque bureaucracy and sort of grey urban environments and the sort of world of overpowering misery. In which everything is kind of Aesopian. You know, you go and buy a pint of milk, and the way in which you buy that pint of milk is in some way a commentary on your opinions about Leonid Brezhnev or what have you. And you know, the great thing about Innocent Sorcerers is it's a film about the Warsaw youth of the time who were, you know, they read existential literature and they listened to jazz and they had sex with each other and they had quite nice apartments and, you know, they, and that was his world. You know, his world was not that of the workers of the shipyards of Gdansk. His world was that of Krzysztof Komeda and people like that, the world of Roman Polanski. It was the world of, you know, people that lived this kind of somewhat sort of playboy existence in this bombed out but recovering city,
I mean, it's a new
which
wave
had
film.
it's a new wave film, and it's, you know, like, and Poland at the time was very much seen by other countries in the bloc, and particularly seen by Soviets as, you know, a sort of where you would find the most progressive things like kind of music concrete and modern jazz and poster design and abstract painting. And, you know, it's where you would go and you would find all of these things being accepted in a way that outside of Yugoslavia, they really weren't accepted at the time, certainly not in the 50s. So, and that film is very much about that. It could have been made and be pretty similar at the same time in Rome or London or Cologne or,
Yeah.
you know, Stockholm or wherever.
It's a good example if we're talking about Vida as Vida the history teacher. It's a good example that films themselves are historical artifacts. They don't have to
Right,
be literally about national history to provide you
right.
with that kind of insight. And like you say, he was a guy was part of this kind of intellectual society, this intellectual milieu, and that was his life. And yeah, like you're right to point out that. I mean, I think that unfortunately most people's well, unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, most people's idea of that little slice of Polish history now is something like Cold War, the Paweł Pawlikowski film about the
which is
jazz
kind of like,
musician.
a sort of which is sort of like if you sort of replayed Innocent Sorcerers in a kind of like with hindsight, let's say, if
Beautiful
you tried to
2020 hindsight.
if you tried to kind of apply the kind of like people listened to jazz and were sexy, but also they must have been being spied on by the secret police at all times.
Right.
And I'm sure Wajda's file was pretty big, but like, that doesn't mean that the original film was, I think, some sort of like, presentation of a lifestyle that didn't exist.
Right.
It was a presentation of a lifestyle which was limited to those that had done well out of the system, but it was a real thing.
So yeah, like you say, he does also make these films about the contemporary world, the world around him. But then when he is in charge of this Unit X production unit, then he does kind of start to get into these period pieces and so on. And then the one which I think you and I are both particularly fond of, and which I think is actually really helpfully is also really kind of telling for what's so interesting about his historical films, is The Promised Land, from 1975, which is his adaptation of a novel by a Nobel laureate called Władysław Reymont, a kind of a late 19th century classic of Polish literature, which is about, I guess it's about the painful transition to industrial modernity in Poland, told through the story of these three friends, one Polish, one German, one Jewish.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of done like a sort of like a bad 1950s joke, really. This kind of
they walk into
these,
a textile factory.
Yeah, they walk into a textile factory, and a lot of it hinges on a very serendipitous connection between two things that are happening in the city of Łódź. So
yeah, so just to clarify, it's about these three friends who are trying to open their own textile factory in Łódź in the late 19th century, when this kind of industrial textile manufacture and production is taking over the city, and it is this kind of sweeping period piece with lots to say about how horrible capitalism is and industrial modernity, and there's lots of stuff about anti-Semitism or kind of Jewish identity, and there's a whole lot going on. But sorry, I interrupted you.
There's a lot going on, and I think Łódź becomes industrial as a planned project. It's the westernmost point, pretty much, of the Russian Empire. So it's the kind of westernmost bit of Poland that was occupied by the Russians. So it's bordering the German Empire. It's not massively far from the Austrian Empire, and it's populated by people from all over. It's very much a place that's an example of this kind of multicultural Poland that you mentioned earlier. It's its population is Poles, it's Germans, it's Yiddish-speaking Polish Jews, and the industrialists that kind of power this come from all three of those groups, but they were generally considered by Poles and by Polish nationalists to come too often from the German and the Jewish side. And so a lot of it kind of hinges on the sort of the person that for lots of the film you think is the hero of the film, played by Daniel Obryszki, is Polish. By the end of the film, you don't necessarily, his status as the film's hero is rather more questionable. But he's just a point of identification through lots of it. And there was a lot of people like, Reymont, who wrote the original novel, were very much believers in a kind of a Polish national capitalism that would kind of come in and, fill the space otherwise being filled by non-Poles. But Łódź, via kind of the fact that in 1945 it's the largest Polish city because of the decimation of Warsaw, becomes the place where a load of things are put. For a long time, the government is basically run from there. It's still a large industrial centre, and it's also the centre for the Polish film industry.
Yeah, it's where Wajda went to film school.
yeah, where he went to film school and where most of the kind of great Polish films of the era are made. There's the pun that people still like to have out there is Hollywood, which I
Very
think
good.
is cute. Um, it has this sort of double life at this point in the 70s of, it's the center for this kind of Poland that has this very progressive artistic culture, has one of the kind of major European film industries. It also has one of the major modern art galleries in Europe, and still does, founded by Władysław Szymański, the subject of Wajda's last film, After Image. So it's, an intelligentsia city on one level, but most people there are working in textile factories in conditions which are fairly unchanged since the 19th century.
Well, that's
The inner city,
there's that
housing is the same.
there's that great kind of anecdote where Andrzej Wajda, who, as you've previously mentioned, kind of Wajda helped shepherd his career through his Unit X, and he was a one-time assistant to Wajda, and I think it was Żuławski who basically tipped him off. Wajda had been to film school in Łódź, but was basically unaware, being the intellectual that he was, about this kind of industrial side to the town, and it was Żuławski who said, oh, you should make film of this, and it'll be cheap because the factories all look like they did, still look like they do
exactly
in the 19th century.
I mean, it has extraordinary industrial museums, which just because of the fact they've just got all this machinery that was still in place until the mid-90s.
I mean, it is, if this term makes sense in the context in which Wajda was working, it is a anti-capitalist film. It's a kind of comic opera about human cruelty and moments of kind of violence inflicted on this desperate population by this kind of managerial industrial class. And it was certainly taken as such by the Polish authorities when it was made. People, it was like, oh, he's made a film about evil capitalism in Poland, but it's a portrait of Detroit or Manchester or something.
And it's really, and one really, really crucial things in that, and it's a spoiler for those that have not seen it, so they may want to switch off for the next 30 seconds. But the fact that our hero at the end is like, yeah, shoot the workers. Through a lot of the film, you do have this kind of like, he's the good guy, he's going to come out well, in the end, he's not going to be as bad a capitalist as all the others because he's a national capitalist, he's a Polish capitalist. And practically the last scene of the film is him going like, fuck them, kill him.
Yeah, he orders the police to fire on. It is the last shot of the film, is him kind of staring implacably down the camera, a fourth wall breaking whilst
and that's one of the things
fire on the workers.
Yeah, and that really is one of the things about that film that that makes it so enduring, is the sense that there's a lot of kind of easy options and ways out that he could have taken in that film, and he doesn't. And I think that, and I see no reason to think it's not sincere. I see no reason to think that it's kind of Aesopian, that actually it's about 1970s Poland. But that said, the Polish, not national capitalism, but the Polish state socialism of the 1970s did shoot workers.
Right. This is what people say, right?
And this is the thing that I think Wajda goes through this really great kind of resurgence from 69 to 81. And that almost exactly coincides with the period from, there's a sort of student revolt in 1968, which is repressed very nationalistically. The leaders of the revolt are branded as Jews and are kind of hounded out of the country. Now in 1970 on the Baltic coast, there's a workers' revolt, which the government responds to by firing into the strikers and firing into the crowd. There's another revolt in 1976 in the provincial town of Redom. And then obviously in 1980, there's the Gdansk shipyards and the creation of Solidarity. So, and throughout this period, this is a thing that people don't like to point out, but is also true, is that the standard of living of the Polish working class is getting higher and higher. And there is this thing that, people assume that people revolt at the moment in which they're desperate and destitute. And actually, no one revolts when they're desperate and destitute. They're far too concerned with where the next meal is coming from. People revolt when they're able to have the confidence and the kind of that sense that they could actually affect change that comes with a degree of their lives actually improving. And that I think that these two things are very much uncoincidental.
Yeah. Well,
And a lot of those Polish films of the 70s made by Unit X, made by Wajda himself, a lot of them, could be made in West Germany. They kind of present this kind of seedy world of, kind of psychedelic print dresses and Eurodisco and jazz funk and holidays on the Baltic. And, it's a quite affluent world in a lot of these films. And they have an energy to them. And that's one of the things that, The Promised Land, as a sort of, we describe it to people. Oh, yeah, it's a 3-hour epic about the Industrial Revolution. It sounds incredibly tedious. It has
it's
this
not tedious.
unbelievable momentum to it. It's just, the kind of the horror and the pace of it. Like so much of the film, you just got this clang, this constant clang of the batteries, almost being done. It's as if the sort of almost sort of Einstürzende Neubauten kind of, sort of industrial soundtrack running through it. And
it also has at least one moment of completely over the top hyper violence that made me laugh out loud when I was
several. It's been described quite a lot by people that love the film and by people that hate it as a Marxist film, and it really is. But there is definitely an underside that this is being made in a context where a lot of people are working in really big factories. A lot of people are organizing increasingly in trade unions that are unofficial, that aren't controlled by the state. And that when they've gone on strike, they've often been faced with state violence. So that is an undercurrent. So,
and yes, certainly you have to imagine that a Polish audience watching it in 1975 would have, and seeing that final scene where the police turn their guns on the striking workers, would very quickly have got the connection or the reference to 5 years earlier in 1970 when the Polish police fired on striking workers in the northern shipyards. So I mean, so everything we've said there, I think, sets us up perfectly to then talk maybe in conclusion about Man of Marble and Man of Iron. So Man of Marble comes in 1977, and then 4 years later, Man of Iron is this kind of ad hoc, inadvertent sequel. And these are the films which kind of take up this long kind of multi-generational story about workers' resistance and the manipulation of workers in socialist Poland. They end up becoming about 1970, 1968, 1970, all these rebellions and strikes you've been talking about. And Man of Iron is basically about the strike in Gdansk in 1980, which leads to the formation of Solidarity, and then will eventually play the role it plays in the fall of communism.
Right. Man of Marble is a masterpiece. Like Promised Land, it's just absolutely superb. And like it's sort of modeled to a degree on real events. The kind of main character, a kind of Stakhanovite heroic worker who fulfills the plan, is based on an actual guy who was a sort of hero in the 50s, and then sort of disappears from view when everyone becomes very embarrassed about these sorts of Stalinist propaganda efforts. And the kind of main character is, sort of very much Wajda talking about the people 20 years his junior, the people that he's kind of bringing in, like Holland or Żuławski and so forth, who were...
Agnieszka Holland was his assistant director on Man of Marble, and this character, the filmmaker character in the film, is called Agnieszka. So,
well, exactly, it's pretty explicit. And Holland's father was a reform communist who died in quite suspicious circumstances. So she had a certain personal stake in this stuff. That sort of generation of people that didn't feel as compromised by the system as Wajda did were much more kind of able to openly talk about the flaws of it, much more sort of aggressively kind of critical of the sort of various kind of hypocrisies and sellouts and compromises that people were making. And, she strides about trying to find the truth about this guy to this quite incredible kind of Eurodisco soundtrack by Andrzej Wajda. And, sort of gets to the bottom of Stalinism in Poland. And I think one of the things that makes it work as a film is that most of the people in it, certainly the worker, the bricklayer the film kind of hinges upon, really believed, and it wouldn't work. It wouldn't work as a film. It wouldn't work as a sort of ethical story. And I think a lot of what makes those Wajda films interesting is that he takes seriously the idea that one would believe in this. Why wouldn't you? You've got society which in 1945 has been completely destroyed. by fascism. Why wouldn't you kind of, leave your reservations aside, knowing that these people are Stalinist murderers, but kind of go, well, let's give this thing a chance. And that's why the film works, is that, you've got this kind of young character, I think, is kind of like, all you people are just bastards. It's kind of very much her sort of attitude towards it. And I think she has a sort of, there's a level of them sort of speaking for themselves, but also, quite how sort of thuggish and brutal and kind of as fundamentally false the whole thing was also comes across very strongly. There's a lot going on.
It's a film about the 70s, set in the 70s, about someone from the 70s, this filmmaker Agnieszka, played by Christine Yander, investigating the 50s and investigating the kind of rise and fall of this Stahanovite hero Mateusz Birkut.
Yep.
So it's because it has this kind of generational gap at the heart of the film. It basically becomes about two different generations having their own kind of cynical idealism pushed to breaking point, because Mateusz Birkut, this bricklayer from the 50s, he's involved in the construction. It's Nowa Huta that he's building, isn't it? Which is this huge new town outside Krakow, a kind of incredible construction project, whatever you think of the architecture. Who, like you say, he's largely sympathetic to the idea that it would be good for the state to build everyone a house. But then once he starts kind of standing up for his friend, who's subject to some kind of political show trial shenanigans, he is kind of deposed from his public position.
Yep.
And then in the 70s, you have the filmmaker who, it's not like she doesn't come across as a particularly kind of Marxist character or whatever, but she seems to think that she can make an interesting modern handheld film, as she says, in the New American style. She seems to think she can make a film. There's no reason she wouldn't be able to make a film like this within the system. And it's about these two decades, these two generations kind of interacting, if you like, through her investigation, and how they both, there's two different types of idealism that are getting kind of scorched along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, maybe there's people that are more sympathetic to Man of Iron than I am, but it's kind of glib to say this, because, if you've not had to live through something like this, it's kind of, kind of pointing out can sound like you're praising it or suggesting it was easy. But as soon as Wajda finds something in which he really believes, really sincerely 100% supports, so much of what's interesting about him kind of goes out the window. And I think that really happens in Man of Iron. And I think the thing that really mars that film, there's a lot, and, it was made very, very quickly in very difficult circumstances. So broadly speaking, it's a film in which the kind of compromised Stakhanovite character of Man of Marble is exchanged for a kind of uncompromised, really, truly heroic, and also extremely Catholic, actually existing worker of the actually existing Polish 1980s.
Yeah, it was
who's involved in a real strike that's really happened.
Yeah, so what happened was that, we don't need to give people our own Polish history lesson here, but in 1980 there's this strike led by Solidarity in the Gdansk shipyard, which leads to this historic so-called August Agreement, where the socialist government and the striking workers have this big sit down and reach this negotiated settlement. It's seen as a huge kind of hopeful moment. A few months later, martial law was imposed, so didn't work out as planned. But Wajda in 1980, he kind of goes to Gdansk, goes to the shipyard. He's a kind of celebrity, he's a cultural celebrity in Poland at the time. And while he's there, someone says to him, this is the apocryphal story, someone says to him, "Oh, you should make a film about this and call it Man of Iron." And so he kind of realizing that the window to do this will be necessarily very brief, he rushes through this ad hoc sequel to Man of Marble, where the son of the Mateusz Birkut, the bricklayer from the first film, it turns out is now a leading figure in Solidarity. What are the odds? He's now married to the filmmaker Agnieszka from the previous film. And yeah, like you say, it's kind of amazing historical artifact. It's like a lot of documentary, like intercutting newsreels from the time, shot inside Gdansk shipyard. In that, I think it's kind of amazing in that sense, but like just to kind of get into the moment.
And it still has that energy that all of his 70s films have. You know, it roars along.
Yeah.
But
like you say, it's a partisan film in the way that Man of Marble is not. It's a film about how great Solidarity was, and Lech Wałęsa is in it as himself.
I think that's partisan for, I mean, Solidarity is a kind of complicated thing, and I think, you know, we should always, as good historical materialists, not judge things by what they ended up as. And the fact that Solidarity by the 1990s is basically a kind of, you know, a sort of right-wing Catholic, fairly sort of reactionary headbanging movement shouldn't obscure the fact that maybe there were other things within it early on, you know, but, you know, its defeat, I think, is, you know, paved the way for its most reactionary currents to basically take the thing over. And, you know, among them, two identical twins that were child actors who later kind of have a sort of reign of misery that they impose upon Polish culture in the 2000s and 2010s, the Kaczynskis. You know, the Polish kind of centre-right and far-right, and also part of its centre-left, all stem from different factions of Solidarity.
Right, which is why it's such an interesting film, but whatever you think of it as a piece of filmmaking, because for Wajda to have literally gone into that space where this was the unbeknownst to anyone involved, obviously, like the germs, the seeds of all of this were germinating.
Yeah, and you can sort of see, and you can see each faction of it. You know, parts of it could be seen as a sort of Eisensteinian film about, you know, the workers heroically resisting, but the Catholicism of it is really, really huge, and that element of it is really, really highlighted by the way that the filmmaker goes from being this extremely intelligent, slightly cynical, you know, really, really powerful, self-possessed figure in Man of Marble to being, you know, the Polish face of Matka Polka, you know, the kind of, you know, Polish kind of eternal Catholic mother figure that she becomes. And there's loads of crucifix imagery in the film and Virgin Mary imagery in the film that is really, really overpowering.
Well, we'd have to do a whole other podcast series about Catholicism in Polish cinema, good or bad. You know, a vote get to the bottom of whether or not Catholicism was a positive or negative influence on Polish cinema.
Yes, it was a very large influence.
In the 80s, I mean, you've got Decalogue, Kieślowski. We could do a whole... Yeah. I don't know how much free time you've got in your calendar coming up, Owen, but can...
but I think, you know, Man of Iron, it does, you know, the elements of that movement were very reactionary, I think, take over big chunks of the film and make it quite depressing compared with the sort of, you know, the sort of the feminism of the first film.
Yeah.
Really.
Okay, so that's Man of Iron. I mean, there's too much Wajda to really go through. And I think we've covered quite a lot of his historical surveys. So just to round out, and this is probably quite a trite question, but it's never stopped me before. In the round, when we're talking about Andrzej Wajda and we think about his historical films, like what's the principle that emerges? Like, is this we're talking about the reactionary elements of Solidarity there. Is this a guy who's ultimately a conservative? Is there a kind of liberal or leftist angle to him? He ends up being such an establishment figure, but he's also quite subversive. Like, is there a through line that stays the same throughout?
The saving grace of Wajda that stops him just being a kind of, you know, a sort of director of national narratives is, I think, on the one hand, his intellectual curiosity. He's someone that, you know, was always interested in what was new in cinema, what was new in art, what was new in music. And, you know, had this very sort of voracious appetite for that. And you know, his best films often come out of tapping into a particular electric current that's happening at the time. And part of it is also the fact that he's able to register both the sort of appeal of a lot of those national narratives and the truth of a lot of them. You know, Poland really had been put through a load of misery by its neighbours. All of this was true. But also kind of putting it to the test more critically. And I think his attitude to socialism is kind of part of this. You know, he's someone who, you know, when he actually sees a working class revolt happening, he sides with it and not with the police and not with the military. And I think that speaks very well of him ultimately. And it suggests that, that things like Promised Land were very much sincere. They weren't just a kind of like, the party wants a film about capitalism being terrible, I'll give them it. It was actually a film about class struggle, which on some level, I think when one actually happened, he supported. I think that in that point, in that moment, from the 50s till the 80s, he's really one of those kind of lightning conductors. He kind of sits at the center of the thing, and he kind of conveys it, and it goes through him and he's aware of that. He does it very eloquently. When those things change, but a lot of the films kind of just lose all of that because of the fact that he just simply has much less to say.
Well, it's a good thing that we stopped with Man of Iron then. I mean, we would have struggled to get through his 90s and 2000s work. I mean, the guy was a filmmaking machine, and right up until his 10th decade. So,
and I'm sure there are people who will make a case for those. I mean, I've been meaning to see After Image for ages. Hopefully one day it'll be put up on the streaming service so that I can see it.
All right. Well, I'll take that loaded comment as a sign that it's time to wrap up for today. But Owen Hatherley, thanks for coming back onto the Klassiki podcast and walking through this Wajda retrospective with me today. Always a pleasure.
Thank you, Sammy. It's been wspaniałe.